It's a kind of magic, 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 magic.
Dungeons & Dragons made a Warcraft-style RTS is a statement that I cannot make, because they actually made two. We are gathered here today to talk about the first one from 1996, an obscure little title with a bizarre amount of sway over the canon of D&D's Forgotten Realms setting. This was a weird game, and it's got a weird legacy. A number of authors in various official D&D books had to go in after this game and write convoluted lore to explain how this aberrant little game makes sense. Because this forgotten one-off game from an unknown studio, this small story about mad mages, princesses, and elemental lords fighting colossal, albeit usually very petty, wars with legions of golems shaped from bloody forges, managed to set canon to this very day for an entire region. This is Dungeons & Dragons Blood and Magic. But this is also the tale of an obscure section of the D&D world called the Utter East. But before we dive in, if you're a tabletop fan and all this talk about the Utter East ends up interesting you as a location to set your campaigns, then why not check out today's sponsor, Chepeku. Chepeku is a team of fantasy battle map makers, and they rule. Listen, okay, they've put together a library of 4,000 hand-drawn maps for your tabletop games, and it's all available for you in a huge bulk package if you sign up on their Patreon. But that's not all, because they drop a new map with several variations every single week. Each of these is optimized for any and all virtual tabletops you might be using, but they're also printer friendly if that's what you prefer. The scale of these maps is so perfectly variable for any of your needs. Battlefields, dungeons, huge set-piece encounters, Chepeku has you covered. Look, you want to run some Utter East games and you need maps for Bloodforge encounters? Chepeku has a ton of portal-focused maps that would do the trick. Or you can just find a neat battlefield and drop a Bloodforge wherever you'd like. Tell you what, I've even gone an extra mile here. I've taken the time to stat out Bloodforges and Basal Golems for D&D 5e to help you along. So I'll provide a link to it down below with Chepeku's info. It's in the description and the pinned comment. Go grab yourself some Golem stat blocks, pick a Chepeku map that works for you, and introduce your players to some of the weirdest D&D lore around. So head on over to their Patreon. Sign up to the Master Cartographer tier, and you'll gain access to everything your heart could want. But wait, cause that's actually not the whole package. Because if you sign up to their highest tier, then every month they also put out an animated map compatible with virtual tables like Roll20. Once again, big thanks to Chepeku for supporting the channel. Now, we should talk about how an oddball game like Blood and Magic came to exist. Although D&D as a video game property has become essentially synonymous with various styles of role-playing games, back in '96 there was actually some existing precedent for D&D as a strategy title. Games like Shadow Sorcerer and Stronghold had already paved the way for Blood and Magic. Indeed, in the wake of the RTS boom post-Warcraft and Command & Conquer, D&D actually seemed like kind of a natural IP to take a shot at the newly popularized genre. We talk a lot about D&D video game licensing on this channel, due to how intricately it's always been tied to the sorts of games we get with this IP. 1995 saw the passing of the torch for this license, with SSI no longer having the exclusive D&D rights. Rather than give the license outright to another company as they did with SSI, TSR, the company that owned D&D at the time, chose to shop out different D&D settings to different publishers. While the exact details of who got which segments of the setting is something that was never truly public information, we do know at least that Take-Two was given D&D's horror-focused Ravenloft setting. Interplay, and through them eventually BioWare on the other hand, had the Forgotten Realms setting. So if you're wondering why almost every D&D video game post-1998 is set in the Forgotten Realms, well, it's because during the golden years of Interplay and the BioWare Renaissance, that's what they had the rights to make. And by the time Interplay had locked themselves in as the D&D gaming publisher, games like Baldur's Gate and BioWare's Neverwinter Nights had turned the Forgotten Realms and the continent of Faerun into a household name amongst gaming communities. All of this info is actually relevant to Blood and Magic, because the game was the very first D&D game made by Interplay. Immediately after getting a hold of the license, they set about two projects. The first was repurposing the Descent engine into a dungeon crawler that would come to be known as Descent to Undermountain, in hopes of inheriting the legacy of the old SSI dungeon crawlers. This game was famously terrible, and it got stuck in development hell until 1998 due to Interplay not assigning enough programmers and staff to accomplish the task of turning a flight engine into a role-playing game. This compounded with the company focusing on more promising projects that started to come down the pipes later, such as Baldur's Gate. But the other game that they started working on immediately after getting the license was Blood and Magic, which did come out in 1996. This game was developed by a small team called Tachyon Studios, and this ended up being their only game. With the D&D license having so recently traded hands, there were really only two types of D&D games that came out in '96. Old SSI projects that were only just being finished now, or unrelated new games that were hastily dressed up to appear as though they were D&D upon receiving the license. We know from my deep dive into Iron and Blood that this was the case with that game. Ravenloft was quickly painted over an unrelated fantasy fighting game, and the result was a game that utterly failed to live up to Ravenloft in any meaningful way. Educated guess is that Blood and Magic has the same origin, an unrelated game about blood forges that was quickly taken over and turned into a D&D property, thus making 1996 the year of Dungeons & Dragons, Iron and Blood and Magic. But unlike its Ravenloft peer, Blood and Magic was a bit too unique to be so easily rebranded, especially if forced by licensing to stick to the Forgotten Realms setting. We are pretty far into guesswork here, but I'd reckon this is why they set the game in the Utter East, a region just off the map of Faerun, which had been briefly mentioned in the tabletop, but not really fleshed out. It was so decidedly obscure that various sources all the way into the modern day simply use the term Utter East, not as its own location, but instead as a nickname for eastern regions off the edge of the map. This region of questionable canon would allow the devs to essentially start anew with a blank slate, and simply slot their pre-existing world building into the Forgotten Realms setting. Again, now all of this is speculative, but I feel pretty solid in my guesswork here. I have reached out to some devs to confirm as well, but I've heard nothing back so far. I'll make a community post if I hear back, so subscribe to the channel if you want to be kept in the loop. Anyway, the Utter East was not exactly the perfect blank slate, and the lore from Blood and Magic kinda stuck out like a sore thumb. Because while we didn't have much info on the Utter East, we did have info on everything surrounding this region. This place is the connection between the steppe nomads, Faerun, not Asia, and not Arabia. It's kind of fantasy Crimea, or maybe the Caucasus. It's a place very much in the center of where countless cultures meet. So the fact that the Utter East is presented in Blood and Magic as sort of classic Western fantasy, well, that's actually kind of weird. Although it might just be easy to ignore this and assume that the region would be better fleshed out and given more local flair later on when the writers were paying more attention, that's actually just not where various authors and fan canons went with it. They could have ignored it, but instead they found an entirely different explanation for why Western fantasy tropes were here in such a far-flung section of the world. Colonists from the Moonshae Isles sailed on over here and conquered the locals, called the Mar people, who spoke a language related to the not Middle Easterners nearby. These Mar were then enslaved by the colonists, though later upgraded to being second-class citizens. I reiterate, none of this is in Blood and Magic itself. This is all post-hoc lore written by authors like Peter Archer and Troy Denning in '98, as well as folks on the old Wizards of the Coast forums between 2007 to 2009. The fan canon based on this game and various sparse details of the Utter East pretty much ended up being adopted wholesale into the 2007 book The Grand History of the Realms. Anyway, that's how this silly little RTS ended up inspiring the Utter East to become Faerunian Rhodesia. Okay, but how could it possibly get worse for the Utter East, you ask? Well, what if these colonists, after conquering and enslaving the locals, were to burn down the entire region in a series of astonishing petty wars after they discovered magical army printing devices called blood forges? Yeah, how about that? That'd sure suck, wouldn't it? Blood forges were these ancient weapons from wars between the gods in prehistory. They gathered together mana and forged them into basal golems, which were capable of further gathering more mana, or being reshaped into army units of various sorts. The power of infinite multiplicative growth is inherent to these forges, with each golem accelerating the speed by which the next one can be shaped. Overnight, any dipshit with a cantrip can command armies of thousands of unfeeling warriors. The power-mad Moonshae colonists, mere decades after conquering the Mar, reduced the Utter East to a maddening war zone in the span of days. And they kept it that way for 10 years of agonizing warfare. And that is what our game is about. The Bloodforge Wars. Blood and magic, baby. Now, I remind you, this game is just a cute, funny little RTS that had a bunch of dark lore added on in a post-hoc manner. So, while it's not intended for you to be horrified by the frivolity of these conflicts, it does happen to be a bit of a gut punch if you view all these goofy warlords as despotic slavers. The campaigns of Blood and Magic cover 5 different conflicts, with 3 different maps each set within the Bloodforge Wars, and you're able to control either side of the conflict to achieve different endings to the story. And once this campaign has been finished, you'll also gain access to a second, legendary campaign, in which you play all 15 of those maps again in a random order with your own custom character in order to unify the Utter East and put an end to the Titanic conflict once and for all. The delivery on this concept and on the gameplay is actually really great, which makes it a little bit sad that this game has been so utterly forgotten. The fact of the matter was that Blood and Magic was a solid entry into the RTS genre, but it came out during a particular time span when being solid wasn't really good enough to stand out. Now, Blood and Magic came out in '96, which puts it in the earlier side of the entries of the mid-90s RTS flood. It still ended up being lost in the tide that would come. RTS games had existed in various forms since at least the late 80s, but it was the release of Dune 2 by Westwood in the December of '92 that really codified and popularized it. Immediately, games like Blizzard's Warcraft and Westwood's own Command & Conquer series iterated on the suddenly relevant genre over the following 3 years. With the release of Warcraft 2 and Red Alert in '95 and '96 respectively, the floodgates had broken open, and dozens upon dozens of titles crashed upon the world. This market saturation meant that most gamers missed Blood and Magic. It actually did have one quirk though that could have made it stand out from the crowd in a very pleasing way though. Rather than your resource units needing to collect resources from deposits, Blood and Magic directly ties mana generation to your golems. Your little basal dudes just sit still and they'll transform into obelisks, which will begin to generate mana, which can thus be used to build more golems to generate even more mana. The catch is that these golems also are needed to be transformed into units or buildings. And so, while this game does lose the need to protect supply lines to some degree, it gains this fascinating quality of macro decision making that is really quite satisfying. Your economy runs on virtually unlimited, explosive, and multiplicative growth, and if you stop to make combat units, your economy will fall behind in orders of magnitude compared to your rivals. So the question becomes, how do you disrupt your enemy's infinite money printer while protecting your own? And all of this with the endgame of knowing when the exact right moment is to reforge your plowshares into weapons of war. At which point do you change to a war economy and start generating units? In terms of multiplayer, I'm certain that this probably gets somewhat old somewhat fast, but it's a lot of fun versus the AI. They don't abuse growth the way that the players do. Thus, they mobilize really early, and often they have a ton of additional starting resources that you don't have access to. So the game becomes about playing really smart and turtling hard and just scraping by and gathering every single advantage you can, just trying to lose slowly in ways that tilt the economic scales in your favor. Sure, the enemy did kill one of your golems, but the golems are worth 40 mana. And they had to sacrifice a 40 mana paladin in order to make it happen. Plus, they used the heal spell numerous times at 10 mana a pop. You're 60 mana up compared to them now. All of these little good value trades are how you win the harder levels of Blood and Magic. You just have to survive by the skin of your teeth until your economy hits that critical tipping point when you can flood the battlefield with a massive army. The economy in Blood and Magic is great for what it is. It's a cool little shake-up of the genre. And it came out at a time when all of these mechanics we associate with RTSs were just being codified. Things only start to feel samey or stale after you've sunk probably around 20 hours into this game. And while, yes, the system does reward turtling, skirmishing is absolutely possible, and also highly rewarding if you can manage to sneak out a few good combat units to get some early kills. While this was probably never going to be a satisfying system for a long-lived multiplayer game, it makes Blood and Magic a phenomenal single-player RTS that I'd recommend hardcore RTS fans give a chance to, even in the modern day. Final point on the economy, because it ends up tying nicely into how the combat works, is that more often than not, you're going to find that an infinite huge economy isn't always going to be that useful anyway. On most of the maps, there are so many small choke points that you'll end up finding the entire combat frontline is completely filled. You'll usually win on these maps, not by having a gigantic economy to crank out units to wait in line to attack your enemy, but rather by winning the micro game. Swapping units around to ensure that you've got strong melee guys at the front, repositioning your ranged units to fill out your entire back line for maximal damage, and not to mention the usual RTS strategy of making sure your units are focus firing effectively. But there are still interesting macro decisions to make even here. Do you choose to broaden the front lines? On some maps, terrain will actually be destructible, thus allowing you to expand the battlefield beyond these little choke points. It's a great way to overwhelm an opponent with a smaller economy. Otherwise, there are flying units. They're weaker and they're more expensive than other units, so they'll really only end up being valuable once the front lines are already filled, and the battlefield has started to resemble World War I's Western Front. Alternatively, they're also great for skirmishing and picking off basal golems early on if you invest in them. Other maps, though, are absolutely huge, and the front lines end up being gigantic. This is when the biggest economy will inevitably win. Both styles of map design are honestly very welcome, as it provides a lot of gameplay variety. This, combined with the fact that different campaigns and maps will start you off with only very specific unit types available to you, means that the game is tremendously fresh with each and every map you go to. And these maps, they are such a highlight. The variability of front lines and checkpoints is masterfully designed, but I gotta throw extra love towards the Puzzle Palace map. Holy hell, everybody has to pass through the central areas if they want to control more than one type of unit building. But there are switches everywhere to raise and lower bridges, meaning it's an absolute flurry of chaos and units plunging to their death as both players try to pass through or even hold on to the central platform. Chaos. I love it! So about these units and unit buildings. There are 5 in total, and they work in place of army factions like you would find in other RTS games. These buildings are all themed. A temple which recruits holy units, a barracks which produces martial units, the Arbor Lodge for producing druids and nature units, and a crypt for raising the dead, and finally a summoning stone for magical units. Each one of these buildings offers a number of recruitable units, some overlapping with other buildings, but others are completely unique. Further complicating the system, on maps where you control a cauldron, each building can also spawn and recruit a unique type of monster unit. The variety is great, though admittedly most of the time a shield wall made up of paladins plus rangers ends up being the winning combo, especially since both of them can be recruited from one building, the barracks. Still, there are edge cases where you may simply want wizards on your backline, or you want your frontliners to be druids, or zombies, or ghouls, or even stone golems. But while some units may be just blatantly better than others, you won't always get to choose what you're working with. Especially near the end of the campaign, you'll be surviving the early waves just by the skin of your teeth, and you'll have to work with whatever you've got until you can painstakingly wrest control of the map away from the AI. If it's not obvious already, I really liked this game, and I enjoyed the hell out of my playtest. That said, there are some problems, and the biggest is the absurd amount of micro you have to do in this game. The largest example of this is the resource collection. Your golems will automatically transfer mana to your forge once they've generated 10, but you can, and should, collect it manually before that happens. Why? Well, like I said, this game is about snowballing your economy as fast as you possibly can. So, let's suppose I have 15 mana stored away, and I have 5 golems, each of them having 5 mana charged up. If I force all of them to give me the mana now, then I have 40 mana, and I can use that to build another golem to start building more resources. If I waited for all of those golems to reach 10 mana and then transfer it, then I've missed out on the mana that I could have earned from recruiting that golem faster. And you really need to pump these guys out with maximum efficiency to get ahead of the enemy. But here's the problem. You gotta manually withdraw the mana from every single unit. It's awful. It's terrible. It hurts my entire soul to be constantly microing my resource units. And there are a lot of terrible, fiddly, and unneeded things when it comes to the micro as well. There's no rally points, for example, so you need to manually recruit and move every single one of your golems to the barracks for transformation into a unit. Likewise, unit pathing is so appallingly awful that trying to use the lasso to give group orders is just a waste of your time. You'll just have to manually move every single unit individually if you want them to actually follow your commands. They'll just freeze up otherwise. But as grating as all of that is, I imagine all the rough edges of this game could be hammered out in as little as a few weeks by a band of determined modders. Especially because the base code of this game was actually released to the public. I'll put a link down in the description below. Really, someone modding a collect all mana button to the game, adding rally points, and turning off friendly unit collision so that units are actually capable of moving in groups, that would modernize the game pretty preposterously well. But for all those flaws, Blood and Magic is still an excellent game. It's got a bad reputation for being really quite difficult, but I didn't find it to be so bad for the majority of my playtime, excepting the final few levels. I powered through them as best I could, abusing terrain and hyper-specific unit/map combos to barely eke out wins, but eventually I did hit a map I could not complete. It was the 15th map of the Legendary Conquest, so I didn't get to see the final unique level after. Frankly, there was just nothing I could do about being attacked by a horde of stone golems within 1 minute of game start. Honestly, it's probably beatable if you micro perfectly, and I did get close to stabilizing my run a few times, but in the end, I just couldn't make it work. So now, let's quickly take a second to talk about the presentation of this game before we wrap up the game's story. Generally speaking, I think the game clearly has some good art direction behind it. The units are super recognizable at a glance, really just nice to look at, and also well designed conceptually. Likewise, the art used in cutscenes is top-notch, to a really surprising degree. That said, although the art direction carries the game a ways, it clearly looks like it's a year or two behind the curve in terms of the great 90s graphical arms race. The game still looks good, despite the tech limitations, and it's clear that the team did a lot with what they had, both in terms of the look of the maps and the units. Still, much like the gameplay, doing a good job wasn't good enough. Not when there were 20 or more major RTS titles coming out each year. It was go big or go home, and it's not much of a surprise that this game didn't grab people in comparison to the competition. Likewise, the music is strong, and a number of threads and blogs about the game mention it as one of the more memorable aspects. Still, I do feel like a bit of a fraud talking about it, since the archive version I was able to get running didn't have any working music during the gameplay, only during the cutscenes. Still, the music sounds solid, even if I never personally got to experience it. Here, you can decide for yourself. The voice work was another high point. It seems like this game didn't have all that much funding to work with, so while they likely couldn't afford a big voice cast for individual units in the way that was quickly becoming the norm in this genre, they instead chose to focus their efforts on having a single, good narrator. And on a budget, I think it was a good pick. He's got an above-average voice for D&D games of the era, and I never found myself really missing unit quotes like you'd hear in other games. The SFX were similarly decent, with combat always sounding correct. That said, the sound for collecting mana is so much goddamned ear destruction that I feel like I have to conclude the soundtrack as a net negative overall, just due to how much you hear it. Straight up, when I was hearing this, I had someone nearby ask me what that annoying noise was coming from my headphones. Right, well, I suppose we can conclude the game's story. Let's return to the Utter East and the Bloodforge Wars. Like I said, the story campaign is 5 little individual conflicts, so let's lightning round our way through them. Story of the first campaign is a bit unconventional. In the Kingdom of Dogen, a band of Moonshade Northlanders show up and conquer the place. Before he dies, the king curses the invaders that a scourge would tear them down. The princess flees, finding a necromancer willing to help her fulfill the curse. We get to choose between defending our newly conquered kingdom as the Northlanders, or play as the necromancers bringing dark justice upon the land. I chose to play as the necromancer because it was the right thing to do. The second campaign really shows off the frivolity of these conflicts. Princess Roxana doesn't wish to be wed, and declares that she will not be unless it is to a man who can defeat her in battle. It might have been a charming little tale, were it not for the fact that Roxana is a slave queen, and was about to invite neighboring knights and princes to her land to invade and ravage the countryside in an enormous and pointless war. Anyway, after defeating them all in my game, Roxana grows bored and abandons her kingdom to go on adventures. In terms of frivolous nobles who are tearing the Utter East apart with Bloodforge magic, I figure she's about par. Next, we learn that since the discovery of Bloodforges, it's not only mortals who are using them. A trapped god of chaos named Tartaron wishes to break free of his shackles, and the war allows him the possibility to break free from his fiery prison. I play as him, and he doesn't destroy the world at the end of the campaign, he simply retakes his place in the Pantheon. Next up, we finally get a view of how these Bloodforge-wielding idiots are affecting the populace. A pair of brothers wage war upon each other in a supposedly comedic campaign over who can control an artifact called the Pearl of Power. I play as the occasionally good brother and protect the capital from being set ablaze by destroying the aqueduct and drowning everyone. Last, we get a heroic tale of good and evil as a lone wizard protects the East from monsters that catch and devour colonists. By now you've heard how I feel about these slaving colonists, so is it any wonder who I side with? Justice for the Mar. This campaign is extra fun, by the way, because you get those extra monster units the whole time. Okay, well, now we've completed the story campaign. And all of these little scenarios kind of just set the stage for the Legendary campaign. The Utter East is an utter catastrophe, and the Legendary Conqueror is about the only one who can put an end to these megomaniacal spellcasters who are burning it to the ground. So you go around, never once slaying a good man, only bandits, slavers, and criminals, and at long last, the kingdom is united. In theory, not in my game, cause that last map was unwinnable for me. Across the entire internet, I found only a single German Let's Player who managed to beat this game.
Also, willkommen zur letzten Map von Blood Magic. Die ist extrem schwer.
Ja, es ist schwer. Es ist so incredibly schwer, mein Dude. But so the story goes that the Conqueror puts an end to the Bloodforge Wars and unites the Utter East. Now controlling all the kingdoms and all the Bloodforges along with their potential for infinite, multiplicative economic growth, the ruler has all the power of a god. And what would you do with that power? Would you better the world? Would you heal the kingdom from a decade of prolonged conflict? Would you right the wrongs of the kingdoms and free the slaves? Well, the legendary ruler chooses to do none of those things. Because next stop, after conquering the East, was to literally break down the gates of heaven and take their place as a god. Fuck everyone in this entire story, especially the player character. Anyway, spin-offs would give us the aftermath of the legendary ruler's actions. Having shirked their responsibility of rebuilding the lands after the ravages of war, the kingdom quickly fell back apart. We did it, Patrick. But at least the Bloodforge Wars are over now. And thankfully, there were zero long-term consequences to using mysterious ancient Bloodforges to wage massive wars. That's nice. Except it turns out that the mana we were using for the Bloodforges was apparently being used to sustain a vast underground prison complex. We let Tartaron out first, and that went okay, but it went a lot less good when we released a gigantic army of fiends that began butchering everyone. Oh, and now since the Bloodforges no longer work, no one has an army to do anything about it. What? Why did no one tell me that infinite growth was unsustainable? There were literally no warning signs! So after the Shattered Kingdom gets slaughtered down to just a few holdouts, the Caliph of Zakara arrives with an army, the likes of which the Utter East had never before seen, and decides to just go all culling of Stratholme on the entire subcontinent before withdrawing after the plague of fiends has been defeated. The Utter East basically gets wiped out to less than 5% of its population as a result of the legendary conqueror's actions. The survivors rebuild, and although the remnants of the Moonshea settlers still manage to hold power over the post-apocalyptic remains of the East, the Mar at least manage to revolt and earn themselves a place as second-class citizens instead of slaves. But until such a time when Wizards of the Coast decides to write further lore out in this region, which honestly seems unlikely, that's the Utter East. And that's Dungeons & Dragons Blood and Magic. I highly recommend this one, actually. It's such a fun game, and learning the bizarre effects it had on D&D canon has been such a delight. Once again, you can pick up my Basal Golem / Bloodforge character block down in the description below, and I'd really recommend pairing them with some Chepeku maps to get the full effect. Also, consider supporting the channel on Patreon. It's a great way to help me produce independent videos of high quality. You'll even gain access to a monthly Patreon-only podcast where I talk about behind-the-scenes stuff in all my videos. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.